Hi, Dr. Hughes.
Hey, how's it going, Dr. Hynes?
It is going well. I'm very excited to talk to you about some Merchant of Venice today. We've got the first big Shylock speech.
I know this is a big one. It's the first time I was thinking actually, the play's called The Merchant of Venice, but it's debatable as to who's the main character sometimes. I mean, you could even think Shylock was, and here we have the meeting of Shylock and Antonio, the merchant and Shylock.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension here, and a lot is going on with the power dynamics. So I think we want to pay particular attention to that. So I have my book. I don't think you have your book, right? You're using the Folger online?
I am. I'm using the folder online, so I'm ready to go though. It's the same as your book, so
Excellent. So no matter what text you have, if you're following along at home, you want to go to line 116. It's on page 35 if you have the book. So like Dr. Hughes said, this is the beginning of the confrontation, the real confrontation between Antonio and Shylock. And I think we have to think back to that previous passage that we looked at in module 2, where he talks about the ancient grudge that he has against Antonio, because he's really going to elaborate on that here.
yeah, I was thinking about that's in an aside, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that aside is this very private moment, and so now it's as if it all comes out in public. So these two asides that we had earlier, where we had Antonio talking and then Shylock talking, now here we are in this public sphere, and it's no longer private.
Yeah, and Shylock has been waiting for this. I mean, he says that grudge is ancient, and he's been waiting to catch Antonio on the hip, and now he gets to do this in front of people. But he has to be strategic because, in terms of power, he can't. He's not in a power position with Antonio because of who he is.
No, but he does have the one power he does have, I guess, is he's got this money, and that's what Antonio wants. And so he does have power for this brief moment. In the larger sphere, he doesn't have as much power as Antonio at all. So you're right. I mean, he's going to take what he's got and use it the best he can.
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing is if we bring in into the triangle, bring in Bassanio, it's for Bassanio that Antonio is doing all of this. He wouldn't get involved with Shylock if it weren't for Bassanio, which I think adds a whole nother interesting emotional layer.
Well, it definitely shows how close they are, and how what kind of a friend Antonio is. To do this, to do something, to go and ask for money from somebody that he can't stand in order to help his friend.
Yeah. So let's look at how Shylock starts to talk to Antonio. First of all, he calls him Signor Antonio right away. And he brings up the fact that many a time and oft in the Rialto, which of course is where all the business happens, you have rated me, which means berated, about my monies and my usances. Still, I have borne it with a patient shrug. So we know this has been going on for a long time, and he's had no ability to do anything about it.
Yeah, he even says that he's been patient. And it's interesting because patient sounds like a really great quality. You know, patience is a virtue. But in this case, I wonder how that patience actually sat with him. He may have had to act patience on the outside, but we know on the inside, he must have been furious.
Yeah. And he says that he has practice. I'm really interested in why on line 120, Shakespeare puts parentheses around for sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. And so he comes back to that, the our, that plural first person, and also tribe, which we talked about in module 2. But why put that suffering and that tribe, which is so important to him, why put that in parentheses?
That's a great question. I wonder if it's, um, I don't know. I wonder if part of that is his desire. It almost feels like a little bit of passive aggressiveness when I see it in parentheses like that. Because obviously you don't speak in parentheses, but it's as if he's sort of adding it in just to let Antonio know that Antonio's crimes are not just against Shylock, but against all the Jews.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah, I like that. And that comes to the question of tone too, how he's delivering these lines, which is
I know,
a
I
big
know.
question.
I mean, some of the things that, well, when we go through here and we see what Shylock is reminding, he's really reminding Antonio of this, but for the audience, he's telling them that this is what has happened in the past. And it's some pretty heavy stuff. Antonio has called him misbeliever, cutthroat dog. He has spat upon my Jewish gabardine. And then a little bit later, he repeats the spitting and he mentions kicking. you have, let's see, you that did void your room upon my beard and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. That's actually the second reference to a dog, which is interesting because I think, Dr. Hynes, you know this, that there's going to be a lot of animal imagery that's going to come up in the play. And a lot of it begins in this speech.
Yeah, and then he calls him a cur, I think is interesting too, that it's, you know, it's like a mangy dog too. It's not
Yeah.
even a regular dog. And the void your room upon my beard to me is such a good detail, because when he says void your room, it's like that, you know, like when you have a cold and you cough something up. Like he's just spitting on him a little bit, like this is disgusting. And he's spitting like in his face, on his beard. And there's very little you can do that's more disrespectful than that. And to do it publicly, going back to your public-private comment from earlier, to do it
Yeah.
publicly in front of everyone where Shylock does business is just, it's terrible.
It's completely humiliating.
Mhm.
And so this is a pretty, you know, I mean, for Shylock right in this moment, he's got to be feeling pretty powerful, even though we know in the big scheme of things he doesn't have any, because here's this moment where suddenly Antonio needs something from him.
Yeah. And he says, let's see, it's line 124, I think. Well, then it now appears you need my help. And so I have it marked with a star in my annotations with a note about this being the shift in the power dynamic. So all of this time, Shylock has waited for this. And now here it is. And so I'm interested in what you think about sort of starting around line 130, going back to
Mhm.
what you said about him being a little bit passive aggressive in line 120 about the suffering of his tribe. I think he does that more starting on 130 and to the end. So
Well,
what do you know?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at the rest of the speech, should I not say, hath the dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? These are a set of rhetorical questions, right? I mean, they're not real questions. They're questions for which the answer is obvious. And a lot of times rhetorical questions are a very kind of passive aggressive technique, right? Shakespeare isn't really suggesting that Shylock's wondering if a dog can lend money. This is all Shylock's way of saying, wow, here you are, you need my money. But can a dog lend money? He says, or should I bend low and in a bondsman key with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this, fair sir, you sped upon me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog. And for these courtesies, I will lend you thus much monies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his tone is pretty great there. And I think I love that you use the word, that you brought in the rhetorical questions, because I think what everybody should put in their notes or their annotations is that this is where we start to see Shylock as a rhetorically very, very savvy. This is a really smart man. So he is patient, he is smart, he has the money. There are things that make him very dangerous to Antonio. And I also love that Shakespeare brings in some things that we've talked about a little bit, where he brings the dog back in, the bondman's key. If I'm not sure, does it say in the online folder? Does it give you?
No, it doesn't.
Because a bondman is in a bondman key is in a slave's tone of voice. So there's this power thing that he's saying here. And then when he calls him fair sir, I tell my students to look out for the word fair throughout the play. And so here he's really playing with that. He does not mean, it's like when he says to Bassanio that Antonio is a good man, he doesn't mean he's good, and he doesn't mean he's fair here at all.
And in that regard, I guess we've got, I mean, that's kind of verbal irony, right? Which is another form of sarcasm of kind of a passive aggressive address. I was thinking about what you said earlier about how Shylock has clearly been kind of gathering up all of his anger for quite a while. And here it is suddenly out in the public. And that's why I think, you know, to have a rhetorical approach means you've had time to think. This is not a kind of gut instinctual reaction. This is clearly, with these rhetorical questions and at the end of the speech, something he's been saving up and has thought about. Even makes you wonder if he himself has wondered, Shylock, will there ever be a day when Antonio will need my money?
Yeah. So he's probably pretty excited.
I think he is pretty excited. So what do you think? I mean, how would you read this? If you were playing Shylock, would you, I mean, he could be really angry here. He could be reading this in a pretty irate, angry tone. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think he could be definitely. There's a lot of anger under the surface, but I always think that he's reading this in a more passive aggressive way, that he's
Hmm.
more calm. I think there's more power in being calm to him
Yeah,
at this point, but we want to keep an eye on that going forward in the play.
right.
And then what about Antonio's response? If we think about tone, I mean, I would feel terrible if I had done those things and somebody called me out on it. I would be like, ooh, sorry, especially if I wanted money from them. But Antonio,
Antonio just turns it right back, right? I am like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. And it's interesting because then he says, you know, if you're going to lend me this money, lend it not as to thy friends.
mhm,
And so he's acknowledging this is a business deal. And
mhm,
it reminds me a little bit of Back to Shylock's Aside, where he says, I hate him because he's Christian, but I hate him more
mhm,
because he lends money for free. So there is all of this religious tension and discrimination against Jews, but there's also, maybe even more importantly, the conflict between these two is so much about business and money.
yeah. Yeah, and Antonio shows that maybe he's not as good a businessman as he thinks because he says, don't lend money to your friends. He goes on to say, lend it rather to thine enemy, who if he break, thou mayst with better face exact the penalty. So, I mean, it's good advice. It's a lot easier to take money back from somebody you don't care about.
Right.
But the whole thing is that Antonio is going to give the money. He's going to turn around and take it from his enemy and give it to his friend, to Bassanio.
And his friend, what kind of record does Bassanio have in terms of paying back his debts?
Terrible one.
Not
So
so.
yeah, he doesn't take his own advice. And so if we think about that, who in the play has already told us it is so easy to teach other people what to do and so hard to do it yourself?
That would be Portia.
Yep. So here we see Shakespeare is, I mean, he is a master craftsman.
Yes,
So,
he is.
all right. Well, I love this speech. It was super fun to talk with you about it.
Yeah, thanks. Me too.
And our students are going to do some Google Drawing annotations of this speech. So hopefully some of this will be of interest to them when they start putting that together.
Well, I look forward to talking about more because this is just the beginning.
Yes. All right. Okay.
Okay. Bye,
Bye,
Dr. Hines.
everyone.